room. The reading room. The reading room. The reading room.
Episode 25, No Time to Die.
James Bond retired from active service and is living a peaceful life in Jamaica when he's approached by his old friend Felix Leiter. Leiter asks for help in rescuing a kidnapped scientist. Bond's mission leads him to a dangerous global conspiracy involving a new high-tech weapon and a mysterious villain named Safin. Now, Jay, that is No Time to Die in a nutshell. What do you remember about this before rewatching it recently?
Andy, obviously the film came out only a few years ago at the time of recording this episode, so I think we should remember quite a bit considering it's quite recent. However, I couldn't really remember much about the plot, so I remembered that Madeleine Swann returns, Bond has retired, then coming back, then he died at the end. Spoiler alert. I remember that there was a car chase involving Bond and Madeleine and their daughter as well. I remember that Blofeld returned. I remembered Saffron as well. And I also remembered, I think this is probably the only point in terms of the plot that I remember, that there was nanobots. Other than that, I can't remember much else, really. So I think it's quite a lot. But like I said, we watched this. We didn't watch it when it came out of the cinema, like you've mentioned before. So we did watch it at home, but it was within the last 12 months. I don't think that's too bad. And like I said before, I've only watched it once, so this is the second time that we watched it. How about you, Andy? Because I know you've mentioned it before that you've watched this a few times, haven't you?
I have, yes. I saw it at the cinema, got it on Blu-ray that Christmas, watched it over Christmas, and then I've seen it maybe 3 or 4 times since as well. So like you, I remembered quite a lot. I remembered a bit more about the story as well, but we'll get into that as I go on. So what I've noted as my memories were the opening, with the flashback scene and Madeleine, quote unquote, betraying Bond. I remember there's a Spectre party in Cuba. I remember Safin, I remember the nanobots, and I remember that there is a new 007, which again will be a talking point throughout the podcast, I'm sure. And I remember that Spectre dies, and that Leiter dies, and that Blofeld dies, and that Safin dies, and that Bond dies. So maybe the film should have been called Plenty of Time to Die. But let's get in a little bit deeper, shall we? So the main villains, we've got a few. We've got Safin, we have Blofeld, Logan Ash, Obruchev, and Primo. And a couple of Bond girls, Dr. Madeleine Swann returns, and Paloma.
The theme song is No Time to Die by Billie Eilish. And the opening credits, so when it first came on, it replicated the circles that we had from Dr. No. There was ice, Greek, statues, moving cogs, love hearts as clock hands. There was at least one sinking car, a Bond silhouette, an hourglass, guns forming DNA strands. That's obviously links in with the nanobots. And then we had the throwbacks as well, which we had in Spectre as well. So we had Vesper, Madeleine, and Saffron's mask as well, that we're going to discuss in a few minutes. Now, the all-important body count, so James Bond kills only, was 66 in No Time to Die.
Yeah, it's an impressive number. We've got a few gadgets. Got an EMP watch, QDAR, and Smart Blood is back, which was introduced last week in Spectre. Bond gives his iconic Bond James Bond 1 hour, 5 minutes and 24 seconds. No surprise to hear that he was drinking martini again this week, but you may be surprised to hear that we do finally see Daniel Craig's Bond in a hat. No throwing of the hat, but we do see him wearing one. Now, Jay, next question. What was your favourite scene?
I think there were quite a few strong scenes here, Andy. And I'll mention later on which ones I thought were very good, so I won't mention them now. However, my favourite one is probably the chase scene that involves Bond, Madeleine and their daughter. And it's the one that's in Norway, where they're driving over the bridge and then they go into the forest and they're being chased by the villains and a helicopter comes and you got motorbikes. And I just think that was really good. And it's one of the few times that you sense Bond actually has something to lose. And I don't know if you say he's quite vulnerable where it kind of goes back to on a Majesty Secret Service with Tracy. But this one, you know, because you've got a young girl, you've got, you could say, the love of his life, maybe, up there with Vesper and Tracy. I just had that feeling where he was really worried about losing someone that he loves. What about you, Andy?
Loads to choose from, I thought, but the one that I went for is the party in Cuba with all the Spectre agents. So this is where we see Paloma. We'll get into the detail of it, obviously, as we talk later in the pod, but I just thought the whole mix of action, there was some humour in there, there was some twists along the way in terms of, you know, one part of the scene in particular which really threw a curveball into the film. Just really, really well done, well shot, and just a fun scene. So, another question we're asking every week. How many times did you reach for your phone?
Now, Andy, I recorded 0 here, but I must admit, it was very close to 1. And I remember I was writing my notes, and I remember my left hand was going for the phone, but I caught myself because I thought I'm on a really good streak of having 0 reaches for the phone, and I thought I will look at it after the film finishes. So I think it was Bond related from memory. I thought I was going to kind of do on the fly research. I think something must have happened in the film, and I thought, oh, I'll go and check that. And I thought, no, I stopped myself because I didn't want it to be finishing on our last film where I reached for my phone. Now that's put the pressure on you, Andy. Did you reach for your phone then?
So despite having seen this film many, many times, maybe you'd think I don't need to concentrate as much, but I resisted, and I'm also recording a 0. Now, next question, Jay. I hope you're not going to give a 0 for this answer, but what was the all-important rating out of 10?
I gave it a very solid 8 out of 10, Andy, and obviously we go in a bit more in depth when we talk about the rankings and ratings later on in the show. But I think that's a respectable score, I think, to finish the season 1 on, you know, in terms of rewatching the films. What about you, Andy? Did you go higher, lower?
I went slightly higher, and I gave this a 9 out of 10. This is certainly one of my favourites. But we'll find out soon enough where exactly that fits in the ranking of 25. But 9 out of 10. Very, very good effort. So let's get a third opinion, shall we? Jay, what did your wife think of this?
I was a bit surprised. So she said it was a good length because you had to fit quite a lot of things in. And she said Primo was a weak henchman, which I agree he was. However, when she said it was a good length to fit everything in, I remember turning to her and seeing her like snuggled up on the little sofa, and I'm thinking she's not even watching it. And then when she said afterwards, I said, "What do you reckon of this?" And she said, "Oh, it was a good length, you know. It needed to be that long to fit everything in." I was a bit surprised. For me, I can't think of much filler, really. You know, you're going to talk about how long the film was, but I don't really recall much filler. You know, where we spoke about Spectre last week, where I said, you know, there were some scenes that you could basically get rid of, or even get rid of the Bond girl as well, Monica Bellucci. You could take her out. Whereas this, I felt everything that they covered needed to be in there. So did you manage to get your wife to partake, Andy? Because I know you've mentioned in the previous weeks that she might be watching this one.
Yeah, for several weeks I did have a verbal agreement in place. But I think the Skyfall experience kind of put that idea to bed. She really didn't enjoy Skyfall, so she was reluctant to watch this. But she did see basically everything before the title sequence, so the first sort of 20-25 minutes or so, really. And the quote I had from her, which I'm taking this as a positive, she said, "I almost found that to be interesting," which I'm taking as a win. I think secretly there's a chink in her armour against Bond. I think she could learn to like it, but I think that's the best we're going to get. But it's something at least.
It was quite a long pre-title sequence, wasn't it? So she stuck in there, like you said, what, about 20-30 minutes?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't time it exactly, but and and it's not something we're tracking, but it's probably the longest pre-title sequence of the franchise. That would be my estimate. So yeah, she saw a fair bit, and it was a very good pre-title sequence, has to be said as well. Almost interesting to her. The runtime for No Time to Die was 2 hours 43 minutes. It was released finally in 2021 and directed by Keri Joji Fukunaga. Apologies for my pronunciation if that's incorrect.
So we usually talk about the general points here, and we've only got 2 here before we kind of move on. So like Andy says, I do like to talk about the money. The budget, so it was $250 million, which is a reduction of $50 million compared to Spectre. Now, I had a query. Was this reduction due to the pandemic? Did they manage to save some money because of the pandemic in terms of promotional stuff or anything else that contributes to the budget? But interestingly as well, it is still the second largest budget in the franchise so far.
Can I answer that with something that may not be factually correct, but I'm sure I'd heard. I thought the pandemic actually ended up costing the film, not only in terms of box office stats, which I know you're going to get onto in a second, but I think actually in terms of all the remarketing and stuff, because there were so many delays, it ended up costing them tens of millions of dollars, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, because of the delays.
That is an interesting point, Andy, and you're probably right actually. If they've produced all the marketing stuff for the original date, then yeah, they would have had to revise the marketing equipment. I wondered why though. You know, we mentioned last week that the budget was $300 million, and if there was more because of the delay because of the pandemic, but we still only got a shortfall of $50 million, I wonder what the budget would have been then before the pandemic then, if there was more promotional stuff. What we need is, I would love to have someone that works in the film industry, Andy, that does budgets, so they can actually tell us what proportion of the budgets are spent on the different elements. If we got any listeners out there that might be able to help us,
that would be a good shout. I'm just, whilst you were talking, I was doing some live Googling, and from digitalspy.com, there's a Variety report that says the film cost $250 million to produce. Extra numbers, including $100 million to promote, and the price of numerous delays. And there was an estimate that in order for the movie to break even, it would need to make around $900 million.
Wow. I suppose that brings us nicely on to my second point, Andy, the box office stats. So you said $900 million. Well, we can tell you that the worldwide box office returns for No Time to Die was $767 million, which, you know, you adjust it for inflation, which is, you know, we're only talking about a couple of years ago, is a $774 million in today's money. And I don't know how you can quantify this, Andy, but I wonder what impact the pandemic had on this one, because we've said before, haven't we? I think it was last week's episode that each of the Daniel Craig films are making around $1 billion a movie, and this one's only took 767. So you would have said, especially with this being Daniel Craig's last film, you would have said this is a dead cert for at least $1 billion.
I would have thought so, yeah. I guess a couple of things come to mind. I'm not sure of the rules that were in place at the time, but when this was released, was it full capacity cinemas at the time? I'm not sure if it was or not. It may well have been, but the timing of it would suggest that obviously COVID wasn't over. Maybe it even isn't over, but do you know what I mean? It wasn't like in the back to normal phase, certainly not in the UK anyway. But also, regardless of the rules at the time, there's probably still a nervousness about going out in public as well. So maybe that's kind of naturally led to a reduction. So not something we can necessarily accurately quantify, but surely it's got to have an impact for those two reasons.
I remember, Andy, I got 2 points here. You went to the cinema to watch this, so don't you recall whether you had to be a meter apart? But also, I remember reading various articles about this, and No Time to Die was the first blockbuster film to be released after the pandemic. Well, sorry, to be released in terms of the ones that were delayed, and the No Time to Die was kind of like the test movie to see whether films would then kind of be released. It was like the first one that came out after all the delays. So it was a bit of a test on the market from what I recall.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I don't think I saw it straight away when it came out. I think I probably left it a week or two. I don't recall the cinema being packed, but I think I may have actually snuck off work to watch it during the day, to be honest. I can't remember if I booked... let's say I booked the time off, in case my former employers are listening, but I think I might have just snuck away and had a really long lunch break to go and see it, if I'm honest.
A very long lunch break, Ken.
No, I must have like booked a half day or something, he says, for legal reasons. Let's get back into it before I get myself into any more trouble.
The rain room.
Goofs and continuity errors. A couple to go through here. So, on the prison computer scan of Blofeld, his date of birth is shown as 4th of July, 1946. But he's only meant to be a few years older than Bond, isn't he? And then there's a photo that we see in Spectre that's from around 1985, and the newspaper clipping, which was also in Spectre, about Franz Oberhauser's death, which obviously we now know to be Blofeld, in the avalanche. Now the newspaper clipping is quoted as saying he was 16 years old. And my basic maths says that's not right, because if he was 16 in 1985, that means he was born in 1969, not 1946. And that's why maths is important, kids, so you don't make errors like that. And then a second one, and I'm not sure if this would count as a goof or continuity error, but it kind of was a bit of a head scratcher, really. Why did Madeline take Mathilde back to Matera at the end, so Matera in Italy? It's a place of really bad memories, as we'll get onto very soon. And that was not a happy experience for Madeline. And then another question around this scene: why was she speaking to her in English? So this is the final scene of the film, speaking to her daughter in English, but all the way through the film, she's been speaking to her in French.
That's a good observation there, Andy. Maybe they were conscious of people watching on Amazon Prime, and they didn't want the film to end with people not knowing what happened. So they did it in English for everyone.
Yeah, or maybe there was expecting a Brexit backlash in the cinemas.
But no,
let's not get political.
No, we don't talk about politics on this pod. And going back to your earlier point, Andy, about the computer scan, that is interesting. I wonder if the computer was from the original Bond storyline and not the reboot version. They've actually brought out the wrong one.
So, I had the same thought, but Dr. No, released in 1962, meant that Blofeld would have been a teenager. So maybe he was a genius child, and he started Spectre very, very young. But yeah, I had that thought too. But no, I'm gonna shoot that down straight away.
Okay, let's move on then, because Andy mentioned it's a long film, so let's get straight into the film.
The rain room.
Opening scene, we've got the return of the gun barrel, so it's at the beginning of the film again. So there are some notable differences though. So Craig wears a dinner suit for the first time, and this is actually the first time since Brosnan in Die Another Day. We've also got the usual blood effects. The usual blood effects are missing from the gun barrel sequence, and this is probably an indication of Bond's fate at the end of the film. So that is something that I did pick out and said to the missus about this, saying, "Oh, there's no blood on this one."
Does it need the blood? Because you see some throughout the franchise, some with, some without. Interesting to know what people think about that. I'm on the fence, but I thought it worked well. But let's move on. So we're in a flashback scene to start with. We're in Norway, and it's the scene that was alluded to in Spectre, and we mentioned on the pod last week. We see a house, and surrounded by snow. We see Mr. White's basement. We see a Spectre ring in there, and we find out that Mr. White was involved in the poisoning and killing of the family of the masked man that has arrived at the house. It's a mother and daughter. We realise it's a young Madeline Swan, and she witnesses that her mum is murdered by this man in the mask. Not just any mask, it's specifically a Japanese no mask, and my notes so eloquently inform me.
Madeline is actually quite tough for a child, because you actually see her, she shoots the man, drags him out of the house, but he's actually still alive. So his mask is broken as well, and we can see it's Safin, who actually has a scarred face, which kind of brings back memories of Star Wars and the Emperor, for any Star Wars fans out there.
I'm not one of those, so I'll have to take your word for it, I'm afraid. I made a note here that the way he sits up on the ice as she's dragging him reminded me of Michael Myers, or for any wrestling fans out there, The Undertaker. I mean, they're just dead, and then all of a sudden they sit bolt upright.
Yeah, it's quite funny when he does that, actually, because he must have been wearing lots of padding or bulletproof vest. So Madeline runs across the frozen lake to flee from the villain, but she falls through the ice and she's actually about to drown, but Safin saves her as well. Now, Safin is played by actor Rami Malek, whose most notable roles are TV series Mr. Robot and the Freddie Mercury biopic Bohemian Rhapsody. So, Andy, I've not seen Mr. Robot, but it's supposed to be good, but I have seen the Queen film. Have you?
Same, not seen Mr. Robot. Absolutely love Bohemian Rhapsody. Fantastic film, and he is tremendous in it.
Yeah, he's very good. So we jump to present-day Italy, and we see Bond and Madeline in a car, and Bond is actually just taking it easy. He's casually driving, isn't he, at the moment?
Casually is one word. I would say he's driving like an idiot. You see, they're on kind of the cliffs, aren't they? Or the hillside. And he just crosses over to the other side of the road while they're going around a blind bend. Very, very dangerous. You should really watch what you're doing and stick to your own side of the road, because who knows what could have been coming around that corner.
Yeah, and touch wood, I've not had any crashes like that, Andy, but we both live near the countryside, so I do have to drive on some country roads, and it's very frustrating when that happens. But Andy, I haven't wrote this down, but this scene kind of brought back memories of the Quantum of Solace, like the scene bit, the opening scene. I know it's not a car chase like in Quantum of Solace where Bond's being chased, but that kind of scenic view, sunny country, like rocky, the road is quite near like a cliff edge drive. It kind of brought back memories of Quantum.
That was Italy as well, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Not the same part of Italy.
No.
I don't believe.
Coming out of Venice, wasn't it? Vespa died in Venice.
Yeah, not far from Venice.
Yeah.
But yeah, some beautiful roads in Italy.
So Madeline tells Bond to drive faster, but Bond tells her, well, actually, I've deliberately paused there, Andy, because we want to make sure you listen to the one-liner and quotes section there to find out exactly what Bond tells Madeline. But Bond is definitely enjoying this slower pace at the moment. And we also find out a little bit later on that Vesper is buried nearby, and Madeline kind of persuades Bond to visit Vesper's tomb. And we see Bond telling Vesper's tomb that he misses her, and then burns the piece of paper as well.
Yeah, it's quite a poignant scene. He's kind of, it's almost like he's saying goodbye, isn't it, really? But just then he notices a flower and a card with the Spectre logo on it, and the tomb is blown up, and he gets... he's in a pretty bad shape afterwards. I think he reaches for his phone, tries to call Madeline, panicking. But then he gets chased by Spectre goons as he's on his way back. And there's a shot here where Bond kind of dives behind, I guess it's like a rock, or it's part of the wall, isn't it, sticking out. And the car flips over and just misses him. It was really, really well done, that, but very quick thinking. And throughout the whole thing, because of the blast, his hearing is impaired. And the way they play with the audio to kind of demonstrate that, I think, is really, really clever. We then get a customary Bond car chase. Bond's back on it. He's not driving slowly anymore. And it goes back to the hotel. And he believes Madeline has betrayed him, doesn't he, at this stage? And kind of drags her out to the car. And Madeline says to Bond, "There's something I need to tell you." And Bond kind of goes, "I bet there is." Now, hold that thought, Jay. You carry on with what you're going to talk about, but we'll come back to that in a second.
Madeline receives a call from Blofeld and he thanks her. So I put down there, it looks like a bit of a blatant frame job here by Blofeld. Bond's car is surrounded by goons and he's just sat there and Madeline's shouting at him. And it looks like Bond he's either in a state of shock or he's just trying to process everything, kind of work things out in his head. Eventually he pulls himself together and we see Bond fighting back using these gadgets on his car, so like all the machine guns and the smoke, etc.
Yeah, it should be said this is his Aston Martin DB5 that we've seen from Skyfall and Spectre, and obviously previously in Goldfinger and Thunderball. And the scene closes. They manage to get away from the goons. Bond accuses Madeline of betraying him and puts her on a train and tells her that they'll never see each other again. And I wanted to add to my thought earlier that I told you to hold on to. When Madeline's on the train, she stood by the door as the train door closes, and she briefly is like holding her belly. Now, the question I have with this and back to there's something I need to tell you, is she trying to tell Bond that she's pregnant? Because there's reference to, I think, her keeping secrets, and obviously she said there's something I've got to tell him. And the reason I've made that note is because obviously I've said, this is like the 6th, 7th time I've watched this film. Never noticed that before or thought about it in that context. But those two things put together just made me go, hang on a minute. She was trying to tell him all along.
That's a very good observation there, Andy. I didn't notice that. So maybe I need to watch it another 6 or 7 times before I pick up on that. But no, that's very good. My observation here is, how does Bond just fall for this? Because he can't have trusted her very much, considering everything that they went through in the previous film. With her dad dying, with her helping Bond and then going away, and then Bond actually choosing her at the end of the film instead of killing Blofeld. I don't know, I just felt this was a bit weak, that it was like blatantly Blofeld has set her up, and for him just to kind of dismiss everything that they've just shared, and him saying goodbye to Vesper, for him then basically just to dump on a train and say, we're never going to see each other again. I don't know, I just felt that was a bit, not misleading, just a bit weaker.
The only thing I could say in his defence is that he's probably got that sense of deja vu. It's history repeating itself, isn't it? He fell in love with Vesper and she betrayed him. Although, did she in the end? I guess it was too late to find out, but his viewpoint was that at the point she died, she'd betrayed him. And now he's fallen in love again and he's been betrayed again. How did they know he was there? Why was Blofeld so kind to Madeline on the phone? And, the reference to her being Spectre's daughter, and she is the daughter of Mr. White, don't forget. So there's always that lingering doubt there, I guess. But it's a good challenge that you make. I think to me it felt like she was innocent and she acted as if she didn't know what was going on. But obviously his guard's up.
His guard's up. And another point, Andy, before we move on, because we're only in the intro, which we mentioned, it is 20, 30 minutes long. In the Daniel Craig films, he's been quite unlucky, in terms of all the other Bond actors that we've had. We've only had Jules Lazenby, that obviously married and then become a widow. Then Daniel Craig in his films, he's fallen in love twice, and he at this point he's lost both of them, where other actors that have played Bond have never really experienced love before, the majority of them, and Daniel Craig has had 2.
I guess the saying is he knows how to pick 'em.
Indeed. So let's move on. So we can't talk about James Bond without talking about the theme song. So, as mentioned earlier, the theme song was sung by Billie Eilish. Now, Billie Eilish actually became the youngest artist to record a James Bond theme song, and she was only 18 years old. And, the song did win the Academy Award for Best Song Written for Visual Media. And Andy, I haven't listened to Billie Eilish songs before. It's not the type of music I listen to, but I always thought she was English until researching all this. And she's American.
Yeah, I knew she was American. I know a handful of her songs. Bad Guy is a banger. That's a really good one. And You Should See Me in a Crown. That's another good one. But beyond that, I don't know much about her work. But at 18 years old, she's obviously making a name for herself already. It's also the third consecutive Bond theme song to win the Academy Award. So Skyfall and Spectre song. So no pressure on whoever's next. The theme song does appear on the official No Time to Die soundtrack, so that's something of a departure from previous Craig films, and the song debuted at number 1 in the UK singles charts.
Andy, just following on from me saying I hadn't listened to many songs, you've obviously picked out some. I did. While we were writing these notes, I did listen to some of her songs, on the Spotify Spotify system app, and I'm not a fan. I listened to a number of songs, and then I went back to listen to James Bond songs. So yeah, I like this one, but no, I'm not a fan.
Time has passed us by, hasn't it? That's what it is.
Yeah. I just sound like an old fart now. But no, I do listen to more modern music. I'm not one of those people like most parents that listen to music just from when they were younger. I do listen to modern music, but not just. That's not my style.
I'm exactly one of those people, with the occasional modern thing in there. But yeah, I retired from new music when I was about early 20s.
So moving on, the music is composed by a legendary composer, Hans Zimmer, who becomes the 6th non-British composer in a film franchise. However, originally Dan Romer of Beast of No Nation, The Good Doctor, and Beast of the Southern Wild was supposed to compose the film score. However, Romer left due to creative differences. Now, this is an interesting point because this is the first time in the franchise, so out of the 25 films so far, that a composer has been replaced. Now, Zimmer is one of my favourite, if not my favourite composers out there, and he's won 2 Oscars, 4 Grammy Awards, and he's had a very successful career, and he's composed music for over 150 films, and we can't list them all, but some of the big ones are Lion King, Dune, Gladiator, The Last Samurai, the Pirates of the Caribbean series, the Dark Knight trilogy, many, many more, and a couple of others that I really enjoy are Inception and Interstellar. And Andy, I wanted to go and see Hans Zimmer because he was touring around England, I think it was last year, and I looked at Manchester because I don't want to go down to London, and you're talking about hundreds of pounds just to see him, and I'm tight, Andy, I won't pay that.
Yeah, up north we don't like to spend money, but that's quite an impressive list of films he's got to his name, isn't it? There's no arguing there. And I've never really thought about who my favourite composers are, but I have to say it might be Hans Zimmer based on that list because there's some absolute bangers in there. Also on the film score we've got Johnny Marr playing guitar, and also on the lead theme song. Marr was the guitarist for the Smiths and shared songwriting responsibilities with Morrissey. So they're bringing out the big guns for this film. But from the title sequence and theme song, we're off to laboratory at MI6 next, or at an MI6 known facility, I guess. I'm not sure if it's actually within MI6, and it's 5 years later, so we've got another time jump. And one of the first things we see is a really random cameo. Hugh Dennis, who UK listeners may particularly know from the likes of Mock the Week and Outnumbered. He's playing one of the scientists. I just thought that was quite strange to see him in this position. We see the laboratory being broken into, and they kidnap Valdo Obrachev, who we later find out is the scientist who has developed Project Heracles, which is a bioweapon containing nanobots that can attack specific genetic code.
Now, Andy, going back to your point about Hugh Dennis, he's one of those actors, when he was on screen, I thought, I recognise you, I know you're English or British, and I know you've been on various sitcoms, but I couldn't place him. So you've obviously documented there a number of programmes that he's been on. But again, you know, if you ask me now, if you said, Jay, I'll give you £1,000 to name another programme he's been on, I would struggle, because I know he's been in quite a few things, but without Googling it now, I'd just struggle to list any.
The two I mentioned are the only ones that come to mind. He's maybe done some other like panel show type things, but beyond that, I'm not sure.
So there is a very cool scene here, and you know, this isn't a James Bond gadget, but it is very good. I would love to see James Bond have this gadget, and it's where they kind of drop this. It looks like a missile. So when they drop this down, I thought, what they're doing, like blowing like a hole in the bottom, and you know, they were going to escape that way. But they drop this device down that looks like a missile that kind of shoots these smaller magnetic devices that attach themselves to the wall. And then they must use some kind of, I don't know what the technical term is, a magnetic field. So the goons and the scientists, well, I think the scientists actually pushed down, and the goons just jump down, and this magnetic field allow them to like slow down and then land safely. I don't recall I've ever seen anything like that before in a Bond, in any film. So I thought that was a really cool idea. We cut to MI6 now, and this is a very short scene here where we see M and Moneypenny talking.
Yeah, they're talking about what's just happened at the lab, basically, aren't they? And M is hiding something, isn't he? Moneypenny is asking him what's going on. What should she alert the Prime Minister? That kind of thing. And he just says, nope, it was a gas leak. Just tell everyone it was a gas leak.
Yeah, he's definitely not being open and honest with Moneypenny. And M says, where is 007? Now, Andy, I must admit that I didn't get that kind of quote originally when I was watching the film. It was only when typing up the notes for this that I was thinking, oh, he didn't mean Daniel Craig 007, he's meaning the new 007.
It's very clever how they did that, isn't it? Because the very next scene, which you're going to go on to, is Daniel Craig. It's not someone else.
So that one, yeah, that totally bypassed me until I was like, typing up some of these notes. So we jump to Jamaica now, and we cut to Bond, and he's enjoying a bit of sailing and fishing. And Bond arrives at his place, and he notices some ash and a smoked cigar. So he knows someone as being in his little home, I guess you call it, beside the sea, which we obviously know is probably Leiter. That's kind of like I suppose it's Leiter's way of saying to Bond, I want to talk. And Bond, he gets and get ready, has a shower. And a little note here, Andy, which I didn't put down, but my OCD kicked in. Did you notice when he was having the shower, he was brushing his teeth, and then he put his toothbrush like in a little holder? And I was thinking, surely he's not going to leave that out there overnight. Imagine all the bugs and everything climbing on his toothbrush. I'm thinking like, yeah, I'm going to take it back in. But yeah, that's my OCD kicking in there.
That's not a toothbrush holder at all. Yeah. And you say he's having a shower. I think we should set the scene for those who maybe haven't seen it. It's just a waterfall, isn't it, that he's stood under, basically?
It is, yeah.
Like he's doing a herbal essences ad or something.
I tell you what, his shower's blooming more powerful than my shower. I tell you that. Mine's like a trickle at the moment. But Bond gets ready, and like I said, he's taking a drive to the nearby town, and I'm assuming he's going to enjoy the nightlife, or maybe he's going out knowing that Felix Leiter is around. So he notices that he's being followed, and it turns out to be Felix Leiter and Logan Ash, who is another American agent.
Yeah, Bond quips that he smiles too much, which I thought was quite funny. Felix and Logan are asking for help. They want to track down Obruchev, but Bond refuses. So Bond goes to leave, but his car isn't working, but conveniently a woman offers to give Bond a ride, and this is one we kind of saw in the background a couple of times. Well, she wants to give Bond a ride on the back of a motorcycle. She takes him home, and we very soon find out that she's called Nomi, and she's succeeded Bond as the new 007. And there's quite a bit of back and forth between the two, kind of 007 and 007. Yeah, so some nice interplay here.
Yeah, well, that's the only playing that's going on there, isn't it, Andy? Because it looked like this could be another lady to join the long list of Bond conquest, but she's having none of that. So we have another short scene, and we're back at Q branch here, and the old gang are back. We've got Q, Tanner, M, and Moneypenny, and Bond phones M, and he basically says, "What have you done?" M. In my notes was ... So I'm building up the suspense here for our listeners. We jump to Cuba, and we see Bond wearing the baseball cap that Andy mentioned earlier, and I've got exclamation marks. I'm going crazy here with exclamation marks because I love Bond in a hat, but I was a bit disappointed it was a baseball cap, and we've not gone back to the old days of Connery where it's more formal. And this goes against my point, Andy. You know, I think it was in Spectre I mentioned that Daniel Craig's Bond always seems to be quite formally dressed, and now we've got him walking around in a baseball cap.
Yeah, it's the ultimate sign that he's retired, isn't it? It must be. Although, you know, he's back. He's not with MI6 anymore, but he is working with the CIA, and he's also working with a lady named Paloma. Paloma, played by Ana de Armas, who is known for roles such as Blade Runner 2049, Knives Out, and Blonde, the Marilyn Monroe biopic, which is tremendous. If you've not seen it, by the way, I really recommend it. It's a difficult watch. It's deep, it's dark, but she is fantastic in it. Paloma takes Bond to a room, suggests that he gets changed, and there's some fun scenes where, you know, I think she starts undressing him, and Bond thinks, "Oh, hang on a minute, what's going off here?" And she's like, "Oh, no, I've got you this suit." And she also mentioned that she's had 3 weeks of training, and she also, when Bond orders martinis for them both, she downs it. Nice, fun introduction to Paloma here, I thought.
Yeah, I think she's quite spunky. How, you know, she acts. She's very, like, not your normal kind of spy, agent, government worker, is she? She's, you know, there's a bit of bounce around her. And I know she says she's had 3 weeks of training, but I don't think does she mention that she's new or anything apart from 3 weeks? Is that just kind of alluding to that she's quite new? But, you know, she doesn't seem like she's worn down by the whole, you know, working as an agent.
No, I'm not sure if it's serious. She says it's like pretty deadpan, so maybe she is telling the truth. But I think it's all just trying to set the scene in the viewer's mind that maybe she's a bit of a bumbling buffoon and doesn't really know what she's doing. Yeah,
maybe. And I suppose it's another... is that what the MI6 are like now? You know, with Naomi and her young, beautiful, and Daniel Craig's Bond now is just at the other end of his career, and things have just changed. But we see the scientist, and he deliberately drops the sample and switches it. Now, this is the second time I rewatched this, so I didn't remember this. So I didn't remember why he switched it. I obviously remember in a few minutes it becomes clear. And Bond remarks that it seems like all the Spectre agents are here. So you see, you know, the various people eye Bond up, and, you know, he's casing a joint with Paloma. And it turns out that they were expecting Bond, and the poison is released. Blofeld, he's using the eye and, you know, the speakers, and says to everyone, "It's harmless to us." But then the Spectre agents start to drop one by one, and we know why now. The scientist has switched the sample.
Yeah, we get a fight that follows soon, featuring various goons. We've got the new 007 and Paloma and the scientist and Bond. So some really, really cool bits during the scene. Ends with Bond taking the scientist, Obrachev, to the seaplane. What did we... I was just thinking back to previous episodes where we got a bit tongue-tied with the water boat, or whatever it was called. I can't remember what...
That was funny, because when that came on the screen, Andy, it just brought back memories of that episode we did, where we couldn't remember, and the wife said, "It's a seaplane."
It's a seaplane, yeah, which we now know. really, just, I mean, I called this out earlier as my favourite scene. The whole thing from start to finish was fantastic. And I thought Paloma was a really good addition here. And it turns out she's a real badass. She kicks all kinds of ass in this scene. Not bad for 3 weeks training, eh?
Not bad. And Andy, I don't know what your view is on this. This is one of the few criticism I have of this film, that she's not in it enough for me. Even though I said that, earlier on, I don't think there's any fillers, and I don't think she's necessarily needed in the rest of the film. I don't think she's relevant. But it's a shame for me that they introduced her in Daniel Craig's last film, because she could have been a very strong recurring character, I think, in the franchise.
She could have been a recurring character with Leiter, couldn't she, as like Leiter's associate. He sets up the mission, she delivers on them. But yeah, she was brilliant. Really, really good. And I fully agree. It's a shame it was such a short-lived Bond debut for her.
And we find out that Logan Ash is a double agent, so maybe all that smiling was just fake, and Felix gets shot. Now, Ash and Bond are having a fight, and Bond ends up being locked down below and in the boat. I don't know what the technical term is when you go lower in the boat, but Ash blows a hole in the hole, and the boat starts to sink, and Felix dies from the gunshot wound, and Bond does manage to escape in the end. And this is a sad scene, obviously. The comment I had, Andy, and I didn't add this to the notes, was Felix Leiter in License to Kill obviously got attacked by a shark and lost at least one of his legs, but survived. But this version of Felix can't survive a bullet shot. So he's not as robust as the Timothy Dalton Felix Leiter.
In his defence, it's a gunshot wound / drowning combination. So maybe we give him a pass. But I know he was double crossed as well. Don't forget that.
He was double crossed, yes. But so was Felix Leiter in the License to Kill by I can't think of the agent that basically set him up. With giving the money to Robert Davi's character, which escapes my mind at the moment. Anyway, we end this scene with Bond in the dinghy, and this is very different to the earlier Bond films where Bond is lost at sea with the Bond gal, how the films usually end, but he's very lonely, and he's lost his, I don't know if you say his best friend, but one of his close allies.
Yeah, there's not many people he can trust in this world, and he's just lost one of them. So yeah, it's a very sad scene. We're off to London next. And we see the Union Jack Bulldog again that the previous M had left for Bond. And Bond goes to the garage, he uncovers a car, and I recognise the number plate. And I like a number plate that's recognisable. And it's the number plate B549WUU on the Aston Martin V8 Vantage. And the reason I recognise it is because it's the same car that was driven by Timothy Dalton in The Living Daylights. So we've got another case of Daniel Craig going back to a Bond car from a previous Bond actor.
Another good observation, Andy, with your car, especially reg numbers. You'd be great working in like the police, Andy, doing like traffic cams or something, where you have to monitor reg numbers, because none of these just fly by me. I struggle to remember what mine is. So you do very well here, Andy.
I'm like a walk-in AMPR camera.
Does that explain why you're always going to like little dodgy country lanes, just clocking all the reg numbers?
I'm just looking at number plates. Yeah, that's what I'm doing. Yeah. But it's usually, I don't know what the weather's like. That's why I just wear a Mac and nothing else.
Moving on. So Bond ends up saying his iconic James Bond to the security guard, but Bond doesn't start off saying it. He does his, I think he says Bond, and the security guard just is like waiting, looks up, and then Bond is like Bond, James Bond. So he seems a bit put out here, and I think it's another sign that things have moved on at MI6.
Yeah, he's a forgotten man, isn't he? I really, really liked that. I thought it was really cleverly done.
Yeah, definitely. And we get a bit more of this sassy back and forth here between Bond and Naomi, which is I really like the interaction between those two characters. And Bond then tells M he seems very thirsty and small behind the desk, because I think M has a drink, and then while he's talking, he finishes that one, goes to pour another one. And Bond walks out, and he just throws the ID badge into the bin. And I was like, why couldn't you have done that with your hat? That's what I was thinking, you know, because it's in Moneypenny's office. It's like, why couldn't you have done that in the hat? Now we could have done a tick.
Yeah, he's ruined our stats, hasn't he, there? That's what he's done. There's a scene later on with Q, Moneypenny and Bond. It's at Q's flat. I think he's waiting for a date, isn't he? And they're starting to piece together what's happening now with the DNA nanobots. So the plot is thickening. Later on we see Madeline and Safin. They're having a therapy session, I guess it would be. And at this point, Madeline doesn't seem to know that Safin is the man who killed her and saved her from the frozen lake. But that quickly changes because he's got a memory box with him. Gives Madeline the memory box, and she opens it and she sees the broken mask.
Yeah, because I thought at the beginning of this scene where they meet each other, I made the assumption that she remembered, but you can tell quite quickly the way that they're talking that she doesn't recall who he is. Because you know when he sat up and you said like doing the Undertaker bit, I was then trying to recall, did he sit up but she was already running, or did she not see the face, or is it all that trauma that she has so she's forgotten about that? So it's only when at the beginning of the scene where you see them together thinking, oh, he's got something kind of, that's why she's working for him. But then obviously the way they started talking, you think, oh, actually she doesn't recall who he is.
I agree that that's what it seemed like, but I don't see how she couldn't remember, because she definitely saw his face, because that's what made her kind of recoil in horror and start running. And his mask was broken at that point, and the complexion of his face was clear through the mask in terms of like the disfigurement already. So yeah, I'm surprised that she didn't recognize him without his mask on.
Yeah, like any husband out there will always recognize their wives without the mask on, you know, first thing in the morning. So moving on, because my wife listens to that, and I don't want her to put me anywhere in a frozen lake. So Safin gives Madeline the poison, and the wife made a comment here about the age gap between Safin and Madeline. So this is kind of, well, it's not linked to your point, Andy, earlier about the goof and continuity error of Safin's age, but Safin doesn't look notably a lot older. I know he's scarred, but at the beginning of the film, she's a young child. I don't know if it's ever explained how old she is, but I would say, I don't know, 10, 11, 12, something like that, tops. And he's already an adult, and I would have pictured him maybe 20s then. And now, I don't know how old she is now, but you would say she's, I would say she's a doctor. She would have had to go to, like, you know, university. So maybe, would you say she's late 20s, early 30s?
I would have said 30s, yeah. I would say there's got to be comfortably 20 to 25 years between those two scenes.
Yeah, that's the concise way of saying this, Andy, and I was just going the long-winded way there. So I don't think it seems at all that age gap's there. So that's her comment there. Now, Madeline goes to Belmarsh and she sprays a poison onto her wrist, I think it is, or her wrist, and she goes to see Blofeld. Now, she then leaves Bond hanging by not returning the handshake.
Yeah, I just put in brackets here in the middle of your notes, awkward, and it was really funny to me the way Bond just kind of strolls up to her, Dr. Swan, or whatever it says. It's like, no, that's not the way to do it, James.
I post-pandemic, Andy, I don't think I've shook anyone's hand, since it's over. So it's, when that happened, I'm thinking, it's post-pandemic, you don't do that anymore. That was, because obviously it was filmed before the pandemic, but obviously it was delayed because I work in a hospital, so you try to minimize kind of contact and stuff like that. Even though the pandemic is over, you still have COVID around. So when this happened, I'm thinking like, post-pandemic, that's fair enough. And then I was trying to think, I can't remember the last time I actually did a handshake when you did an introduction.
Oh yeah, I'm more of a fist bumper these days, at best.
Now, they go in to see Blofeld. However, Madeline, she's got cold feet and she's not happy, and she leaves, but not before Bond. He unexpectedly handles her, and the poison is transferred to Bond. So the audience know that, but Madeline, I don't think she picked up on that. So it wasn't intentional at all. That was it.
No, I'm not sure that Madeline necessarily knows at this stage what she's doing. I think she was expecting that if she gets close to Blofeld, that will be enough to kill him. So she probably doesn't recognise the fact that if she was to transfer it to Bond and then Bond transfer it to Blofeld, that would kill him anyway. But I do have a question, because I got the same notion from it, that's what happened, transfer from Madeline to Bond, Bond to Blofeld. But wouldn't Bond already have the nanobots in him from the party in Cuba? Because the spray that came down got everyone, including him. It just didn't kill him because of his DNA. So he'd already have that on his person. Well, you know, streaming through his blood. What am I trying to say? Coursing through his bloodstream. There we go. Put that into English. And Blofeld is a member of Spectre, so it would already be in his system. So Madeline, she's kind of innocent, isn't she, in this whole thing?
I saw your question there, Andy, and then I thought back. Now, it's targeted at DNA level. So my only comment would be that when the scientists originally did the targeting in Cuba, they didn't include Blofeld DNA in the targeting, and I think maybe they didn't include. The way that you said is more efficient, but it would then be reliant on Bond going to Blofeld, and maybe Safin knew that he was going to talk to Madeline, and that kind of part of the plan was in motion, so they didn't put Blofeld's DNA in the bit in Spectre. But yeah, it would have been more efficient if they did it with Bond, because then you wouldn't need to bring Madeline into play, would you?
That's a good point, yeah. And I guess obviously at this point the thinking is that Madeline is the only person who gets to see Blofeld. So yeah, you've maybe shot my theory out of the water there, but so it's good detective work. But yeah, just a thought on my side. I just didn't realise. I didn't know whether Bond would already Bond would already have the nanobots or not.
I agree. But an afterthought, Andy, is we've discussed in the past about gadgets. And sometimes they might, inspire, say, the army or secret agencies to develop particular gadgets. I wonder if, villains, at home watch Bond films and say, "Oh, that's a good idea," and then turn to the local, the scientist. "I want you to develop a weapon that targets DNAs, because that is a very efficient weapon of choice." Because they talk about it, don't they, where they basically said you could release it and over time it might go its way to where you need it to go and stuff like that. It's a very efficient weapon.
It's shockingly efficient, I would say. And the fact that someone's thought of it in this fictional world would suggest that maybe someone's thinking about it in the real world as well. So it doesn't bear thinking about. Hopefully it's one of those things that is purely fictional. But no, it's an interesting question. If there are any villains out there, just skip this film. Don't need to worry about it. It's fine. But yeah, back to the film, just to tie off this loose end in more ways than one. Blofeld and Bond are kind of taunting each other through this scene, and Bond loses his rag and starts strangling Blofeld, so therefore it transfers to Blofeld, and Bond lets go and he thinks, yeah, all right, send him away, because he's none the wiser. And then he turns around and Blofeld is dead.
This was another kind of issue that I have with, I talked about Blofeld being wasted in the last film, and he's only in this scene. You hear his voice in the scene in Cuba with the Spectre party. I don't recall you seeing him visually at all in that scene because it's his eyeball. So I just think it's a waste, the whole waste of the character. I definitely prefer Blofeld that was done in the Connery films, how he's teased throughout numerous films. I just find it so frustrating.
Yeah, he's your last level boss, isn't he? In a computer game analogy, you don't kill him first. So I tend to agree. I think underwhelming.
And Blofeld has basically said in the previous film, in last week's episode, he said he was the author of James Bond's pain. So you see things like Vesper, Mr. White, Le Chiffre, Silver. Dominic Green works for Quantum, which is an offshoot of Spectre. But then in the very next film, Safin, who's never been mentioned before, manages to take down the whole secret organization that has been lurking in the shadows of all the other Daniel Craig films. And by whatever minute this is in the film, he's wiped out the whole organization on himself, by himself with the scientists.
When you get into that level of thought, you do kind of go, oh, hang on a minute. Has this been thought through properly? But no, I think that's less about Safin and more about the misuse of Blofeld in this instance. But yeah, very good points.
So we're going to cut through a number of scenes here. So Norway, then we go to MI6 and we're back at Norway. So Bond travels to see Madeline and he confesses that he made a mistake. And this is when we're introduced to Mathilde. So this is you don't see any mention or hints at this stage, do you, that she's got a daughter?
No, she just kind of appears. Shocking revelation that Madeline has a child, and Bond is convinced that it's his. That it's his. Bond is convinced that she is his because of the blue eyes, but Madeline insists she is not his daughter.
An interesting side note, and I think it's interesting, Andy, in the You Only Live Twice novel, and we have mentioned this in that episode of the podcast, Bond has a son with Kissy Suzuki called originally James Suzuki. Now, we didn't mention this, as far as I remember. In The Blast from the Past, which is a short story by Raymond Benson, James Suzuki is killed by Irma Bunt, which is a nice little throwback to On Her Majesty's Secret Service.
Nice full circle there, and an intriguing element of the novels and short stories. So we should probably check those out at some point, shouldn't we?
Yeah, and Andy, I thought this was interesting because I was thinking, so Bunt has basically killed James Bond's wife and James Bond's son. However, she has never been killed by Bond on screen, but researching it, in the novel, it's Blofeld that kills Tracy, but in the film, it's Bunt. So I thought that was an interesting observation, and it's not something I recall we mentioning on Her Majesty's Secret Service with the book versus the movie differences.
I feel like I'm learning this for the first time. Yeah, so this is proving to be quite the educational podcast.
And now let's get back to the film, Andy. That's enough of the educational part of the podcast, or maybe not. Maybe we're going to educate some more people later on, but. We see a portrait of Dame Judi Dench's M here, and also Robert Brown's M. Now, unless I've missed something, Andy, I think they're the only two M's that we see portraits of. I don't recall any other ones. So unless I've missed that,
I can't think of any.
Yeah. So I thought that was quite a nice throwback. And we obviously see M is talking on the phone as well at this point.
Yeah, we flip back to Norway, and Madeline is telling Bond backstory, and we find out he's being tracked by the villains, or at the very least they know where he is. So they have to make a run for it. He's no longer in the Aston. He's, I think it's a Toyota, is it? He's driving. I didn't make note of the car. I just said he's driving a Dadmobile. It's very similar to the car I drive, it has to be said. Although mine's not a Toyota. Mine's a a Honda, but you know, it's a 4x4 with a car seat in the back, the Dadmobile. And we get a car chase along the road into the forest. We've got some really cool bits here. We've got cars involved, motorcycles, and a helicopter.
Yeah, this is my favourite scene. I think it's very well done here, and there's lots of things happening in this scene, and we do see that Bond pushes a car onto Logan Ash. So he didn't last too long, but you know, he did get his comeuppance.
Yeah, this scene kind of reminded me of Roger Moore's Bond in For Your Eyes Only, when there's the car hanging off the edge of I don't know if it's a cliff or hillside or whatever, and then he just kicks the car and down it goes. So that kind of brought back memories of that.
Yeah, I didn't like Logan Ash. I didn't. He's a bit smarmy, and I don't think he really warranted. I don't think he warranted the honour of killing Felix. Really, is my opinion. And Safin kidnaps Madeline and Mathilde. Yeah,
we get a few scenes, or if it was next where they now obviously have to go and find Madeline and Mathilde. Randomly, Nomi asked for Bond to be reinstated as 007, and which kind of gave me a few questions that came to mind. What was Bond's new number when he was originally reinstated? And I think Nomi even asks a couple of times, but doesn't get an answer. She keeps going, 00 what? 00 what? And we never find out. And if she's no longer 007, what's her new number? And does the number really matter when you think about what they do for a living? Is there really that much importance on the number? Yes, we know from a fan perspective that 007 is James Bond, and it's iconic and all the rest of it. But think about what it's like in their world. It's just a number, right? So why does it matter?
There's some good questions, Andy. And 007, it does seem to matter, because Nomi is, like you said, asking questions about who it is, and she makes a point about 007 number, and I think she said something like about retiring it as well. I don't know, and it's not something I've ever researched, Andy, in terms of the 00 agents, in terms of numbering, because you would make the assumption that the lower the better, as in 0001 is maybe better, but you never hear, unless it's mentioned, in any of the novels, or we've missed something, that there's a promotion. So you're assigned a number, but you don't like move up or down. That's a number that you're given.
I wondered whether it was sequential, but then that would make Bond the 7th ever 00 agent, which doesn't seem like a lot.
No, and I would have thought it was sequential as well. But why, if it was, why would they have another 007? Why wouldn't they retire it? Or is it they only have, I don't know, say 10 or 15, and you have people on a waiting list and you have to wait, so someone dies. Oh, the 007's died, or he's left. Oh, Nomi, that's next number available. Do something like that. I don't know, and it's not something I've ever really researched, Andy, about the 00 numbers.
I can't say I've either. My one final thing that comes to mind is it like at the butcher's where you have to pick a ticket back in the old days, and you wait for it to be called before you can get your meat?
Yeah, definitely. The lower the number, then you want there. But we're going to jump now to a plane, but also Poison Island.
Yeah, so Safin and Madeline and Matilda are on the Poison Island, and Safin and Madeline are having words. He knows that Matilda is Bond's daughter. Bond doesn't yet, but it's interesting that Safin knows. And Safin picks up Matilda and he starts walking around the garden and talking about the various plants and what they do. And Matilda, she's a small child, she's interested. She goes to touch one of the plants. Madeline shouts to stop her. And quite a funny quote where Safin says, "This one makes you do as you're told."
Yeah, that is a funny little one. I'm not in love with Safin's character. He plays it. I can't think of the word, Andy. If it's a bit hammy, or the way he acts, it's just a bit weird, I think. And when he's on the Poison Island, it's just, it just really comes through, because at the beginning where you have the flashback, you don't really notice his mannerisms, and then the bit where he's talking to Madeline in like say like the consultation room, it's coming across then. But all the stuff on the Poison Island, it's, I don't know, hammy's a word, I don't know if you get what I'm trying to describe, but it's weird how he's acting.
I think so, yeah. I mean, well, obviously we're going to talk rankings at the end in terms of where they fit. I like the Safin character and I like the way he portrayed it. Reminded me of Dr. No in some regards, but in terms of like the mannerisms and things, there's a thespian quality to it, isn't it? It's not, he doesn't act like a normal person. He acts like someone who wants to show off and have a position of power. Maybe that's why I like him so much, because he is acting like the old school Bond villain, like a Dr. No, for example.
Yeah, he's not a traditional terrorist type of stereotype, is he? He's more of the kind of like megalomaniac type, but there's he has a backstory about it, you know, with his family all being murdered by Spectre. Anyway, so we see Bond, Nomi, and Q flying on a plane to Poison Island, and I've made a note here, Andy, and I mentioned this to the wife. I can't remember which film it is, but I'm sure Q mentions that he gets air sickness because Bond, I don't know if he does like an eye roll or something, so I don't know if it's a film where they first meet, but I'm sure Q says something about he gets air sickness. But he's obviously in an aeroplane now.
Yeah, I saw your note and I made the same note. It was in Skyfall, which is obviously when we're introduced to Q, that we find out he hates flying, because when Bond is in Shanghai, it's Moneypenny who acts as Bond's partner at the casino, because she mentions that Q hates flying. So yeah, that's established. But then Inspector, he goes to Austria. I'm assuming he flew there, unless he got the train, but that's not really an efficient way to travel. And now he's on the plane here in No Time to Die. So so much for hating flying.
Yeah, unless he's developed some kind of anti-sickness tablets or device or something. But Bond and Nomi land on the island via a sea landing on this kind of like stealth plane drone. I can't remember if it's got an official name. And Madeline escapes from her cell as well. Yeah,
we're going to be jumping around a little bit because I think we both went a bit light on the notes here, because this was when the film was getting really, really good. We do see a scene with Obrachov and Bond, and Obrachov says to Bond, "You'll never leave this island alive." I thought that was an interesting bit of foreshadowing in hindsight.
I agree. That is it is very good. Andy, I got a note here, sorry, that I didn't put on the script, but it's something I researched. Apparently, the scientist had a smaller part in the original screenplay, but the director really took to the character and expanded the role to put him in as much as he could. And I think the scientist he is a good character, because, you know, sometimes in the previous films, scientist just works for the villain. However, I know they're not a partner, and he is working for Safin, but he's very much on board in terms of the whole villainous plot, isn't he? With like wiping out populations with this DNA weapon.
Yeah, he does seem to enjoy his work, as well as the money I'm sure that's involved with it.
Yes, yeah, multiple perks. There is a shot here with Bond in a tunnel, and the camera makes it look like the gun barrel sequence, which is very good, I think. And Nomi kicks Valdo into the acid, and Bond kills Primo via the eye that he's got via the EMP, so the eye explodes. Now, the wife, as soon as this happened, preempted the Bond one-liner, and she said, like she muttered, blew their mind, just before Bond said it. So I thought, oh, she's liking his Bond franchise.
Yeah, she's invested, isn't she? She's coming up with her own screenplays in her mind. That's some good call out there. I have a couple more questions around this whole section of the film. So Safin has obviously got Matilda, walking away with her, and I think she bites his thumb or something, and then he just lets her go and go, right, go on then, go. Why would he let her go so easily? That just seemed a little bit strange. And then to your earlier point around Naomi kicking Valdo into the acid, she's gone to a lot of trouble to keep him alive for as long as she has, and then she just kills him, just seemingly at random. Like, just a couple of things that didn't really make that much sense to me.
I totally agree, Andy. In terms of when Matilda bites and runs off, I was like, why have you just let her run off? Because you could use her later on, and you've made the whole big scene about it. You know, when Bond and Safin meet and they sat down at the table, you made a whole big scene of, like, you know, you're going to kill her, you can't do anything, and then he just lets her run away. Naomi, I always find it strange about these kind of things, where I know in terms of building the plot and like the anticipation, but soon as Bond and Naomi enter the room where they've got all the computers, I think it might be, say, like a server room, there is bits, but you got all your DNA and like your lab tables, I would have just killed him. Because you think, if you're going to die on a mission, at least you took the scientists down, and you know, potentially making sure that they can't make any more bioweapons with, you know, the nanobots. So I would have killed him pretty much straight away. But then I suppose, are you keeping him alive just in case you get stuck in a corner and you need some kind of hostage, and, you know, like, you know, that kind of play?
Yeah, or, you know, keep him alive for information or whatever. Just felt, to go to all that trouble and then to kill him so easily, just kind of opposite ends of the spectrum, aren't they?
Yeah, definitely. But like you mentioned earlier, I didn't make many notes during this because, as I mentioned off air, I've only watched this film once before, so I knew how this film ended because obviously I watched it before. So I was really enjoying watching the whole scenes on Poison Island. So there's a lot more here that we know we've not described. You know, in terms of like my next point, Bond and Safin has an island. They have a fight, and he snaps the arm, and Safin injects Bond with the nanobots, and we got that slow music playing in the background, which is really good. And Bond is really ruthless and kills Safin here. But there's obviously a lot more happening, isn't there, at this point? But, you know, in terms of our notes, we're just kind of skimming over because there's so much that is happening in the 2 hours, 43 minutes that you've mentioned earlier on.
Yeah, it's really kind of building to a crescendo at this point. And you mentioned the slow music playing in the background really sets the scene. And realization is set in for Bond. So obviously he's been injected with the nanobots. Can only mean one thing. His sex life with Madeline is ruined. But Bond, he's still got a mission. He needs to save the world. So he needs to make sure those blast doors on the island are opened. I've put reclose, but I meant reopened. So he needs to reopen the blast doors because the missiles are on their way and it's going to blow the whole thing up. But he's hurt, he's injured, he's not going to be able to save himself as well. And you know, I can't do this justice by describing what happens, so I would say if you've not seen the film, you really need to see it. I really like this scene. It's a shocking turn of events. It's really, really well shot. The music really adds to the drama, and I'm not ashamed to say it, I cry every single time I see this. This is, you know, the end of Bond, and I just thought it was absolutely fantastic. I could have said this was maybe my favourite scene, but it's a sad scene. It's a very, very sad scene where everything kind of comes to an end for Bond. Really, really good stuff.
It is very well done. And, you know, people might have different views about Bond dying, whether he should die or he shouldn't die. It is a sad scene. I don't think it made me cry. I do cry a lot of films, but I don't recall this made me cry. The one thing I noted was that I like that Bond went to the top. you could have tried to hide, couldn't you? You could think, if I go down below, I might escape some of the blast. But he basically took it on, didn't he, straight away? He knew there was no point living, because you can't see Madeline or Mathilde. So he just went out there and just faced it head first, didn't he?
Yeah, it really added to the drama. I'm not sure if I've mentioned this in other episodes or whether talked about it off air or whatever, but when he's injected, I thought that would have been a very interesting way to end the relationship between Bond and Madeline, because obviously he's injected, so he can never touch her again, he can never see her again, basically, or his daughter. And then that puts Bond in a whole new world of hurt, doesn't it? But for him to actually die was really, really shocking. So a number of ways it could have gone.
Because does he say to Q, I can't remember if this is explained now or if it was explained earlier on, but he can't even stay alive and avoid them, because if he comes into contact with someone else, then they might get infected but become a carrier, isn't it? So it's not about him just avoiding Madeline and Mathilde. It's about basically they can never cross paths with anyone that they've met before, or afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue the only way to be absolutely certain is to never be in contact with anyone ever again.
Yeah, and I suppose you could have looked at it like Bond, could basically say to M, I'm a valuable agent. You want to keep me alive, so can you basically lock these two in a cell so we never see them again, and I can just go off and do my missions? But I think that would probably take it away from it, really. So moving on, I don't know what your thoughts are about this one, Andy. I'm a bit undecided. So we go to MI6, and I think it's a sad scene, and it's quite brief though. So we got M, Moneypenny, Q, Tanner, and Nomi, and we see them together in M's office, and they have a drink to honour Bond, and they poured a drink for Bond, and it's left on the table, and at least one of them kind of does a little clink of their glass to Bond's glass, and M reads the following quote: "The proper function of man is to live, not to assist. I shall not waste my days in trying to prolong them. I shall use my time." Now, Ian Fleming used this quote for Bond's obituary in You Only Live Twice, so another throwback to what we mentioned earlier, You Only Live Twice novel. And the quote is from All for Jack London, famous for The Call of the Wild and The White Fang. Now, that scene finishes, I can't remember the exact words, but M basically says, come on, N. It's just another day, isn't it, for them? And an agent's lost. So I don't know whether that could have been extended a bit, or by extending it, you kind of then not highlighting the fact that it is just another day in the office. Agents die all the time. It's 007, so, as a franchise, and for the fans, they love James Bond, but for them, it's just another agent. They might be close to him. And so part of me thinking, it's a shame they didn't have like a funeral or drag that bit out afterwards.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think a funeral scene may have had the desired effect as well. But I think two thoughts on this particular scene. To your point around another day in the office, I think it is a bit of that to an extent. They've humanized Bond to an extent, but by doing this scene the way they did, I think they've said, right, it is now just any other day, so it's back to work. There's not going to be extended time off for grieving or anything, because he is an asset, not he is a person, but he's an asset, maybe first and foremost. And I guess my other point around this scene is that I think by having it, it shows that Bond is actually dead. Whereas if you leave it on the explosion, where it looks like he dies, but then it's never kind of finalized, I guess, it could maybe be open to interpretation and say, well, maybe there's a chance he survived. You never know, sort of thing. So I think they almost kind of wanted to put, dare I say it, they wanted to put the nail in the coffin. They wanted to, pin it down that this is actually what's happened. Bond is dead, and we are moving on without him. But I like the scene.
Yeah, I liked it, but I just wondered where it could be different. I've got one burning question, Andy, which I didn't write down. I wonder, this is where my mind is, Andy. I wonder who Bond left the Union Jack Bulldog to. Because obviously M gave it to him, so who did he leave it to?
If he had a will at all.
Yeah.
I'm guessing maybe someone like a Moneypenny. Will he have had time to change his will to this daughter that he's never met before? Who knows? Or maybe she just naturally gets things because it goes to next of kin, sort of thing. Just clear his... Well, they'd already cleared his apartment out, hadn't they, in Skyfall. So, yeah, I guess we'll never know. But that's one of those unsolved mysteries of Bond. Where did the Bulldog go? But let's put a bow on this film, because there's one final scene to finish us off. And when we see Madeline taking Mathilde to Italy. Madeline's talking to her daughter, and they're driving the Aston Martin through the same roads that they were driving the earlier Aston Martin, the first scene of the film. And she says she wants to tell her a story about a man named Bond, James Bond. And the film ends with the Louis Armstrong song, "We Have All the Time in the World," which you will remember from On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And it's the only original Bond song to feature in more than one film. And it's the secondary theme song for both, arguably.
Yeah, and Andy, I don't know, so correct me if this is wrong, but I'm sure I read it somewhere in the research, but I didn't write it down. I didn't stay until the end of the credits or anything, and I'm sure I read somewhere, so unless you did or you know this, I'm sure it comes up on the screen to say, like, you know how you used to say, like, James Bond returns. I'm sure it has some kind of wording.
Right at the end, James Bond will return. Does appear.
The Rating Room.
So moving on to our regular segment of the one-liners and quotes, I'm going to kick us off. And I kind of, we've kind of mentioned this earlier on, actually. So this is between Madeline and Bond. And Madeline goes, "Can you go fast?" Sorry, this is where she says, "Can you go faster?" while they're driving, just so there's no, confusion here. So Madeline goes, "Can you go faster?" And James Bond goes, "We don't need to go faster. We have all the time in the world."
Yeah, he's taking her for a drive, not for a ride. Yeah. We have a short interplay between Naomi and Moneypenny outside Q's office when they're talking about Bond. Naomi says, "I get why you shot him." To which Moneypenny replies, "Yeah, well, everyone tries at least once."
I think this film has some really good one-liners. There's some really snappy interplays between them, interchanges. I really like it. So we got Blofeld and Bond. And Andy, I'm going to say this, and I want to ask a question. Now, James, fate draws us back together. Now, your enemy is my enemy. How did that happen? And James Bond says, "Well, you live long enough." Now, I think that's a play on a quote where you basically say something like, you live long enough to be a hero, you turn into a villain, or you become a villain. Does that ring any bells with you? Because that's what I think that is kind of alluding to. Or am I mistaken?
No, I think you're right. I think that quote seems familiar in terms of the hero villain. Let me do some live Googling, shall I?
Because I think that's what it's alluding to. But then I was thinking, like, oh, am I getting that right? Or am I just mistaken? Or
Okay, so first Google result from The Dark Knight. Harvey Dent says, "You either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain."
So that's interesting, Andy, because you've obviously made a number of observation and comments about Daniel Craig and the Dark Knight trilogy, haven't you, in the past?
There's a definite parallel there in terms of Christian Bale as Batman and Daniel Craig as Bond. Now all we need is the super movie that smashes the two together, Bond versus Batman. Said nobody is going to buy that, are they? Let me add another quote in, again, one we alluded to earlier. So Paloma, when she meets Bond, she says, "It'll be great. I've had 3 weeks training."
It's a good quote. she's wasted. Madeline to Bond. Madeline says, she does have your eyes. And Bond says, I know.
Yeah, and then all things go boom all around him. And then we end the film with the quote I mentioned just a few minutes ago. Madeline turns to Matilda and says, I'm going to tell you a story about a man. His name was Bond. James Bond.
And I think that's a fitting end to end the one-liners and quote segment. So moving on to our next regular segment, and it's just a one comment here. So I'm just going to do this one. So No Time to Die is not based on a particular novel or short story. However, they do borrow elements from a number of novels, including You Only Live Twice and On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Yeah,
nothing more to say about that. We've ended the film on a sad note. Let's lighten the mood, shall we, Jay? Do you want another of my world-famous James Bond jokes?
I do want another one, and I wonder, is this going to be the last time a joke features on the Rating Room podcast? I suppose it's to be determined.
Well, I guess it depends if you think of me as a joke host. Because I'm here every week. But, sorry, so unprofessional. Let's get back on track. So let's go into this. There's a reason why Daniel Craig has grey hair in the new James Bond film. It's because he's got no time to die.
It's brilliant wordplay, Andy. And he's looking very old in No Time to Die. So I like what you've done there. You've wordplayed, and it's observational as well. You're kind of like the Michael McIntyre of the podcast world, because he's very good at observations and jokes, isn't he?
Yes, I'm not sure I'd take that as a compliment though. I'm like, he's a fine comedian, don't get me wrong, but am I not more on a level of your Jimmy Carrs and your Ricky Gervaises? No, I'm not. That's the answer. No, I'm not. Especially since I don't actually write any of these jokes myself.
Don't tell the audience that. This is you're into the comedy world. We're gonna see you on the like the Apollo stage at one day, and I can't think of the comedy circuits that they have, but you know what I mean. So
yeah, at your local flea market,
pantomime maybe.
Oh no, I'm not.
Are you ready? Let's start the quiz.
We're going on to the quiz, and maybe this is the last quiz in the Rating Room podcast. Maybe not. Who knows? So I'm going to pull up the quiz. So just bear with me for a second. So I say this every week, but we do have some new listeners as well. So I'm going to let everyone know. So basically, this is where I'm going to tell Andy 4 statements, and Andy has got to guess which 2 are correct and which 2 are incorrect. So the beginning of the podcast, I did start with only one question, 1 out of 4. And Andy, I thought, shall I revert back to that for the last time we do a quiz? And I thought, no, because I don't want to make it easier for you. I want to try to trip you up. So, are you ready?
For the final time, maybe. Yes, I am ready.
Okay. Oh, the pressure's on here. So, first statement. Lashana Lynch, who played Nomi, has been a big James Bond fan ever since watching GoldenEye with her dad. Second statement. Kari Joju Fukunaga is the first American to direct an official Bond film. Third statement. The film was delayed for so long due to the pandemic that reshoots were needed for some product placements as they had become outdated. And the fourth statement. Ana de Armas had to endure an extensive workout program due to never appearing in an action film before. Most of her roles before Bond were Spanish-speaking romantic films. Do you want me to repeat any of them, Andy?
No, I think I got them down. Wow, you have piled the pressure on. So I'm 24 weeks undefeated. I've had plenty of 50%, too many 50%, if I'm honest, for my own high standards, and a few 100% along the way. But I've yet to have a 0. So you've pulled out the big guns, haven't you? Here. I'm going to say that statement 2 about the first American director to direct an official James Bond, I'm going to say that is true, even though I can't remember all the directors off the top of my head right now, but the few that do come to mind I don't think are American. So I'm going to say that one's true, and I'm going to say that statement 3 around the reshoots required for product placement, I'm going to say that one is also true, because there was quite a massive delay. So I'm going to say false, true, true, false.
So there was a slight delay there while I updated my little tracker. So you might have not noticed that delay if Andy edited that out, or he might have left it in to build the suspense. Anyway, so Andy, the first statement in terms of Lashana Lynch, you said was false, and you've got that correct. So Lynch had actually never watched any of the Bond films prior to getting the role in No Time to Die, and once the casting had been confirmed, she went back and rewatched them from Dot to No to Spectre. So it's a shame we didn't do this podcast before, Andy, because she could have listened to our podcast and rewatched them week by week and learned some other bits.
We could have done a 007 podcast with 007.
We could have. And, you know, that might happen in the future when they've done a casting and, you know, a person in the film, they might think, oh, you know, I'm going to look for a podcast about James Bond, and they find the rating room. And then they will listen to us week by week. And then they probably tell people on the set and say, no, have you heard these two guys, Jay and Andy? And then we just build up a following. And then that's when you get cast in the new Bond film, Andy.
That's could have how it works. Or if we'd have done this after Spectre and done episodes 1 to 24 with Jay, Andy and Lashana. Whichever, or would it be Lashana, Jay and Andy? I guess we'll you know, work that out in our minds in terms of what this fictional podcast would have looked like. But maybe she's cast, she joins the podcast for research, and then the film crew come and meet us and say, oh, I want to know what Lashana's doing, and they go, hang on a minute, we've chosen wrong here. Lashana, you're out. Andy, you're in. And I become the new 007.
I could be the villain because I don't wear a mask, but the wife likes to put a bag over my head, so you know it's quite good in terms of covering my face. But moving on, Andy, the second statement that you said was correct. So Fukunaga is indeed the first American to direct an official Bond film. So there has been Americans that have directed Bond films, but they're not the Eon official Bond films. So I try to confuse you there because I know we're not covering the non-official Bond films in this franchise, but that might have muddied the waters. Now, the third one, the pandemic delay, meaning reshoots. God, I got right tongue-tied. It's getting late. For the product placements is correct. So you got that one right. And interesting, Andy, they did spend quite a bit of money doing reshoots. However, there's a scene with the Nokia phone, which was, you know, because technology moves so fast, the phone in question, the Nokia one, was out of date and obsolete. However, they didn't reshoot those ones because of the amount of money it would take to reshoot that particular scene. So they did keep that one in.
Interesting. So that's why we see James Bond on his 3310 playing Snake.
Oh, the good old days. And that means the last one is also correct. I was hoping this one get you on. So Ana de Armas She didn't have an extensive workout. And Andy, this is really interesting. She only had 3 weeks of training. And apparently she kept phoning the director up and saying, I've only had 3 weeks of training. I'm not going to be ready. And she kept telling him. And he basically said, say that in the film. So they put it in the film. So,
yeah, that's nice.
Yeah.
I like that.
So well done. So in terms of the last quiz of the James Bond film so far, 1 to 25, you finished with 100%. So
I'm pleased with that.
A virtual pat on the back.
Yeah, I mean, there's no time to die, but that's a very good time to score full marks.
That is very good. And like I said, there's no prize. We finished season 1 in terms of rewatching it. We do have a special episode coming out, and as we mentioned before, we've got some James Bond super fans. But that is the last quiz that I'm going to give you, Andy. Maybe we'll bring it back in season 2, maybe not. But well done, Andy. I haven't prepared any kind of plaque, or I'm not going to whip out a certificate or anything, but well done. I think that's been a fun segment, and it is a good way of testing your knowledge.
It is, and I'm pleased with my performance. I'm gonna give myself a rating of 7 out of 10 for my quiz performance over the season. Let's move on. I'm waffling. I'm gonna have to edit all this shit out.
The rating room.
So moving on, our last segment is the infamous, famous ratings and rankings. We are the Rating Room podcast, so I'm going to kick us off. So the run times. So Andy obviously mentioned that No Time to Die was 2 hours 43 minutes. Now it does go in at number 1. It is the longest Bond film so far. Interestingly, the top 3 are all Daniel Craig films. The top 4, in fact, are all Daniel Craig films.
The top 4 and the bottom 1.
Yes, top 4 and bottom 1. So he does like to dominate top and bottom, which is a thing apparently. So anyway, talking about the thing that we introduced, not at the beginning of the podcast, we did introduce it at some point, I can't remember when, the average runtimes and the runtime in total by actor. So Daniel Craig, we are going to cover this in our last season, which is end of season special, so make sure you listen to next week's episode. So I'm not going to go through everything now, I'm just going to tell you where Daniel Craig finished. So after No Time to Die and the end of the franchise so far, Daniel Craig clocked in at 11 hours and 44 minutes, and that places him in second place with an average runtime of 2 hours 21 minutes, only to be beaten by Jules Lazenby by 1 minute. And I don't know, part of me thinks maybe we should exclude Lazenby, but then we've put him in there for completeness, but Daniel Craig might be a bit hard done by, and maybe if they added a few minutes onto Quantum of Solace, he might have been higher.
Maybe, yeah, if they'd have done the full film and not just what they managed to cobble together during the writer's strike.
Yeah, indeed. Now, moving on, the kill count. Now, No Time to Die, mentioned earlier, 66. That goes in at second place. I don't think there was any doubt, really, of beating Spectre at last week's franchise high of 232, which, listen to last week's episode, we mentioned why that is so high. So, kill counts by actor for the whole franchise so far. Daniel Craig has finished his run. So across the 5 films that he's had is 342 Bond kills, which is an average of 68.4. So based on our statistics, he is the deadliest Bond in the franchise so far. So we have to see what future Bonds, how they stack up against Daniel Craig's version. Last one from me before I pass over to Andy is the Martini Watch. So as Andy mentioned, Daniel Craig does drink a martini in No Time to Die. And make sure you listen to next week's episode where we kind of recap the martinis and the other areas that we're discussing now.
Indeed, we will. Let's move on to the introduction of Bond, James Bond. So this came after 1 hour, 5 minutes and 24 seconds, which is the 4th longest or 18th shortest, depending on which way we look at it, out of the 21 films that we had an introduction for. 4 films we didn't hear that introduction at all, but it's only the 4th one to break the hour mark So took him a little while to reintroduce himself, I guess you could say, based on how the scene went. We mentioned earlier there's no hat throwing, and there hasn't been for quite some time, but we do see Bond wearing a hat, a baseball cap this time around. So for his final outing, Craig does don a hat. Felix Leiter, he's back in business. Jeffrey Wright is also back for the third time to take on the role. So he was the only Felix Leiter during Craig's era. And now, next one, Jay. This is the one that you really like. It's the box office. So, as mentioned earlier, No Time to Die clocked in with a budget of $250 million, which is the second highest budget of any film that we've had. Worldwide box office of around $767 million in real terms, which, casting my eye over things, and apologies, you may have mentioned this already, it's the third highest taking of any Bond film, behind Skyfall and Spectre. So in terms of the adjusted box office, not a great deal of difference, because obviously it's so recent, although as we're recording, the inflation's at such a place it's going up. I'm waffling again, let's carry on. So No Time to Die comes in 11th place in the adjusted box office, not too far behind Quantum of Solace. A respectable outing, especially considering the times in which it was released. And just briefly to give you a little bit more information on that, it means in terms of adjusted box office take-ins, Craig tops the list with an average of approximately $964 million. So just less than $1 billion per film. 4.8 billion total adjusted box office. That is quite the pot of cash.
Yeah, and when you look at his films, Andy, it's the Quantum of Solace and No Time to Die that have let him down. And No Time to Die, like we mentioned earlier on, would be massively impacted by the pandemic. So, like I said earlier, I do think he probably would have averaged $1 billion a film if it weren't for No Time to Die.
Yeah, I mean, he's had a pandemic and he's had a writer's strike to deal with. So a couple of pretty seismic events for the movie industry.
Yeah, two things that you can't control. So moving on to Bond girls, we've got the two that Andy mentioned earlier on in the pod, which is Dr. Madeline Swan and Paloma. Now, I'm going to start with Paloma, so I'm going to go for the lower rating one, and I put her in at 29 just because she doesn't appear in the film enough for me. So when you look at the people in my ranking, so look at our website, and you can see, mine and Andy's full list, because now as I scroll down, we've got 77 Bond girls at the end of the Bond franchise so far. And Paloma, she's gorgeous. She can look after herself. She's witty, spunky. There's some good comedic lines in there with Bond. So I think she's brilliant, but I just can't put her any higher because of the other people above her. So, like I said earlier, it's a shame she wasn't introduced earlier on in the franchise, or I don't know what they're doing with the franchise now with Craig going, if they can bring her in the next film. I don't know how it works, because Daniel Craig's run is kind of a bit of a silo. We don't know, but it would have been lovely to see Paloma again. Now, Madeline Swan, Dr. Madeline Swan, I put her in Unlucky 13. And just because I do favour the older traditional Bond girls. So when I look at my top 10, I've got people like Honey Rider, Melina, Anya, Tatiana, Pussy Galore, Tracy, and then just out of the top 10 I've got Solitaire and Domino. The only kind of modern Bond girls is I've got a couple from the Brosnan era, Wailing and Jinx, and then Vesper. And I just don't think Madeline Swan is as strong as those ones. I think she's got a good storyline. You've got the complexity there with her being Mr. White's daughter, and as Andy mentioned, Blofeld says earlier on in the film, She's a daughter of Spectre, so I like the storyline, but she personally doesn't do it for me. So that's my justification. How about you, Andy? How have you ranked these? Do you favour the modern Bond girl, or do you favour the traditional ones like I do?
I guess I'll answer that question fully in next week's episode, but what I will say about the two from No Time to Die is we do have a difference of opinion. So I've got Paloma in at 14, and the lack of screen time is certainly something that's holding her down, but I thought she was tremendous, and with a bit more screen time and a bit more of an integral part to the film, I think she could have easily cracked top 10, maybe even top 5. So despite the lack of screen time, Paloma at 14 is a very solid entry. Which brings us on to Dr. Madeline Swan, who cracked the top 10 last week, and based on her portrayal and performance in No Time to Die, I've moved her up the order, and she's ended up at number 3, so a bronze medal for the Doctor. I think very, very good portrayal in Spectre, but for me this edged it. It added an extra layer to the Bond character. The storyline was stronger. Madeline was more complete as a character, and I think everything about it just screamed, top of the pile almost. So yeah, she goes in at number 3.
So sorry, Andy, just as a reminder, listeners, check out our website. You can see the full list there. There's so many that we can't really recap, can we, Andy? Line by line, like we used to do earlier on in the franchise.
No, we'll get into some more detail in next week's episode, I'm sure, and stay tuned for a bit more information on that at the end of the pod. Let's start wrapping things up, and we'll move on to the theme song. No Time to Die, sung by Billie Eilish. I thought a really, really strong outing, and my favourite song of the Craig era, and for that reason she goes in at number 4. What about you, Jay? What did you think of young Miss Eilish?
Obviously, I mentioned earlier on, Andy, I'm not a big fan of her music. However, she is the highest Daniel Craig theme song, but that is, for me, not really an achievement, because it's top 10, but it's 9th position. One of the things I liked is throughout the film I really enjoyed the score. So not necessarily the theme song, which we're obviously ranking there, but I liked the score, and there were times where it was like the instrumental version playing, so I really enjoyed that. But No Time to Die, top 10 for me in 9th position, and I think that's a good entry for my rankings. Now, opening credits, I think these are so hard to do. So I mentioned earlier on, we got the replicated circles on Doctor No, we got ice, Greek structures, statues, moving cogs, love hearts, there's clock hand, sinking car, Bond silhouettes, hourglass, gun forming DNA strands, which I thought was really good, and then some throwbacks to Vesper, Madeline, and Safine's mask. Top 10, yeah. I don't think there's much to say. Top 10. I think Daniel Craig does have a strong opening credits. That's 1, 2, 3 in the top 10 for me, Daniel Craig films. So yeah, pretty impressive.
I tend to agree. Slightly down on what we've seen previously, because I had Skyfall and Spectre in my top 3. This was a bit of a come down from that, but still a solid effort, and I've also gone for 10th place. So we won't go through all 25, but just casting my eye over things, I also have 3 Craig films in the top 10. Now, villains. This is a long list, so we're definitely not going to be going through all these. We now have 96 villains on our list, because we've added 5 more in this film. I'm going to go in something of rapid fire. I'll explain a little bit about each one, but I'll start at the bottom again. Obruchev, 57th place. a nice character in terms of comedic value. Bit of a wimp, bit of a stooge. A good secondary villain though. I thought he added a lot to the film, but ultimately, not exactly intimidating or going to cause Bond any problems in the long run. But a nice addition to the film. And then I'm jumping into the top half of the table now with Primo in at 45. A lot of good action scenes with Primo, a lot of good fight scenes. I enjoyed his presence on screen, very physical, and at times looked to be a bit of a match for Bond with some of the fight scenes. So a solid effort there. But he is a glorified henchman. He's not necessarily integral to the plot, but a good part nonetheless. I'm going up a few places to 41 for my next pick, and that's Logan Ash. What was the word you described him earlier? Was it smarmy? Slimy? One of those two. Both would apply. But reminded me a little bit of Max Denby from Spectre, but I preferred Max, so he's kind of a few places lower than him, but a decent part. There was the portrayal aspect, and he killed Leiter, so he gets bonus points for that. But solid top half entry. Then we move on to place 32, where I've got Ernst Stavro Blofeld, Christoph Waltz. Much lower than I ranked him last week. Bit of a bit part player, manages to cause a fair bit of mayhem and destruction from behind bars. But again, you mentioned it earlier, his character was wasted. If you think about where we've ranked and spoken about Blofeld in previous films, just doesn't compare really, and it's a shame. It's a shame because Blofeld is an iconic character and deserved better, in my opinion. But pretty well portrayed by Christoph Waltz, has to be said. Which leaves the main man of the piece, Lucifer Safin, played by Rami Malek. Really enjoyed his portrayal. Very, very good villain, and he goes in at the top 10. So he is in at number 8 between Xenia Onatop and Mayday. Sure, many men would kill to be in that position. But again, very, very solid villain, and I've got 4 of the 5 in the top half of the table, so No Time to Die scores quite highly on average in terms of villains. What about you, Jay? What's your thoughts on the bad guys?
So I was disappointed with the villains in No Time to Die. So Primo goes in at 79. He didn't do much wrong in terms of the film. However, I marked him down for 2 main reasons. Bond got the better of him on a number of occasions, and he's not very loyal. So he's working for Spectre, but then when it all goes pear-shaped in Cuba, next thing you see, he's working for Safin. So yeah, he's not very loyal at all. So he's low down on my list. He's just above Elvis, actually, from Quantum of Solace. Now, Logan Ash, the very smiley double agent, I didn't like him at all. So he is in position number 60, just below Max Denby. So those two I'm not keen on. Now, Obuchev, I thought was pretty good, but he is the main scientist, but he's very much a secondary villain for me. So I put him in number 49th position, and just below the Blofeld from Christoph Waltz in No Time to Die. Very disappointing. I can't put him higher than Miranda Frost or people like Koskov or Brad Whitaker, some of the classic films from the 80s. I just can't do it. So then moving up, up like 20 odd positions. So this might be a bit surprising compared to your ranking, Andy, but Safin for me, like I said, he just came across quite hammy. He's obviously got some kind of something going for him because he doesn't age, but I didn't like him. I didn't like him at all. So he is a main villain, so you do get some bonus points there. But for me, he's weaker than last week's Blofeld. So I put him in 22nd position, so just above Carl Stromberg from The Spy Who Loved Me. Now, moving on, the last Bond film that we are doing, unless, you know, we're still doing this podcast in the future and they bring out the next Bond film, and we might have to revisit this, Andy, and do another rewatch, or maybe we're going to add it on and just have to slot the new Bond film in. We can talk about it in the future. So I mentioned earlier on in the pod, I gave No Time to Die 8 out of 10. So as we've mentioned throughout the podcast, over the last 20 plus weeks, we're not having any films in tied position. So I've put No Time to Die in 7th, which is the lowest position in the 8 out of 10s. I couldn't place it higher than Skyfall, which is in 6th position, because I do think Skyfall is very good, only to be beaten by Casino Royale by Daniel Craig in terms of the Daniel Craig era. So top 10, I think that's a solid entry for me. Gold, just to remind everyone, Goldfinger is my number one still, 9 out of 10. What about you, Andy?
So 9 out of 10 meant it was always going to go top 4. And I've put it in at number 3, just ahead of Goldfinger and just behind Casino Royale, who has also got 9 out of 10. Just, you know, all of the things we've mentioned, the villains, the girls, the story, the drama, just a superb Bond film all round. But for me, just slightly falling behind Skyfall, which remains 10 out of 10, and then Casino Royale. So my top 3 are all Craig films, which may or may not come as a surprise. But yeah, a fantastic way to end the Craig era. And speaking of the Craig era, let's talk about the movies by actor. So obviously, since it's 3rd on the list, for me it's 3rd of Craig's films. So just to recap, Skyfall with a 10, Casino Royale 9, No Time to Die 9, Spectre 7, and Quantum of Solace 7 out of 10 is how Craig's ended up, with 42 points total and an 8.4 average. Jay, do you want to just recap your Craig films in order?
Yeah, so my top 5 films, because Craig's obviously done 5, is Casino Royale at number 1 with 8 out of 10, Skyfall number 2 with 8 out of 10, No Time to Die 8 out of 10. So not much to choose between those in my ranking, in my scorings. Quantum of Solace 6 out of 10, and Spectre at 6 out of 10, which means out of the 50 points available, Craig got 36, and that's a 7.2 average. So in terms of the averages by Bond, Daniel Craig is top at 7.2.
Yeah, and on my ranking with his 8.4, puts him top of the pile as well.
So last one, Andy, in terms of our rankings, Bond actors. Number 1, Sean Connery. Number 2, Pierce Brosnan. Number 3, Daniel Craig. Number 4, Roger Moore. Number 5, Timothy Dalton. And number 6, Jules Lazenby. Before I pass over to you, Andy, just to recap what we ranked the Bond actors before we started rewatching these. I had Brosnan, Connery, Craig, Moore, Lazenby and Dalton. So I've got some variation between them. Not many. Most notably top and bottom, isn't it? Mid-table's the same, but top and bottom's different.
Indeed, yeah, you've switched your order out, and I've slightly done the same as well. So my order has ended up with Craig on top, Connery 2nd, Brosnan in at 3, Roger Moore 4, George Lazenby 5, Dalton 6, and again I've kept my top 2 as they were, but on rewatching I prefer Brosnan to Moore, and I prefer Lazenby to Dalton. So it just goes to show that when you look at things through fresh eyes, you can get a fresh opinion on things.
Indeed. Andy, before you sign us off, I've done a bit of live Googling, because when we were talking about it earlier on about the 00 agents, I had this burning kind of desire to look into this. So this is what I've found, and listeners, do let us know if you've got something a bit more reliable than Wikipedia. So Andy, 00 agents now. So according to the novel Moonraker, it establishes that the section routinely has 3 00 agents concurrently. However, in the film series Unforgettable, it established a minimum number of 9 00 agents active at any one time.
There you go. That's some good knowledge you've dropped there to end the pod on. So I'm not going to be able to top that. So let's bring things to a close, shall we? So next week we're going to wrap things up from our side. So we've been through all 25 Bond films so far. We've got various things that we've discussed in a little bit of detail, but I'm sure there's various things that we've not really gone into at all. So we're going to come back for one last episode of season 1, just to put a bow on everything that we've spoken about so far. We're going to go into the rankings in a little bit more detail. We're going to go into some of the film plot points in a bit more detail. Maybe some of the general points, research, goose, continuity errors. We're going to go through it all. We're going to recap what we've learned, what we've enjoyed or disliked about this process, and just put everything in a nice, neat package, tie it up, gift wrap it, and give it to you listeners next week. So listen out for episode 26, the end of season special.
Well, that's this week's episode done. We hope you enjoyed it.
Special thanks to the band Sugar Tongue for the theme tune to The Rating Room. You can find them on all the usual social media channels, and be sure to check out their song The System, available now on Spotify.
You can find and message us on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok and Instagram by searching The Rating Room.
You'll find all our social media links on our website, theratingroom.com, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Or feel free to drop us an email at theratingroom@gmail.com. Goodbye, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week, right here on The Rating Room.
The Rating Room. The Rating Room. The Rating Room.